Hello, everyone. My name is Ashla Chavez-Rosano, and I'm pleased to present the 11th episode of In Search of Truth, a supporting online program of the Wende Museum of the Cold War. In today's interview, the program's penultimate of the year, we are joined by journalist, storyteller, and screenwriter Samuel C. Spitale to discuss the recent release of his graphic novel, How to Win the War on Truth. Informed by his background in merchandising at Lucasfilm Ltd, as well as his management career at Global Production Development, which, under his supervision, gained great success as the world's most profitable merchandising program, Spitale has cultivated an intimate understanding of the fabrication of narrative storytelling in both the film industry and commerce alike. His career in journalism has led the writer to work with notable publications such as Huffington Post, as well as Geek magazine and Advocate.com. Holding a master's degree in mass communication, Spitale has proven himself an expert in contemporary media and its structural framework. He is also the author of Star Wars: Collecting a Galaxy. Spitale's immersive use of storytelling takes the reader on an engrossing and informative journey through the history of contemporary media and propaganda, revealing the use of psychological manipulation in commercial advertising and political campaigning, the agendas of corporate entities that often lie behind alternative news outlets and social media, and what this might predict about our shared future in an increasingly globalized society. As we meditate on the use of misinformation and design of propaganda in mass media, we hope to orient towards a hopeful future in which truth can be discovered using the right tools, alongside a community of support for those invested in the well-being of posterity. Today's program will begin with a 45-minute discussion moderated by Emma Larson, followed by 15 minutes of Q&A with the audience. Please feel free to put your questions in the Q&A box as the interview progresses. Keep your thoughts short and concise, no more than 1 or 2 sentences, and 1 question at a time, please. Your questions can be submitted at any point during the program and will be moderated by Student Council member Lexi Tooley. We would like to thank Suzanne Horowitz and Rick Feldman for generously supporting the discussion series at the Wende Museum. And now Emma will begin our discussion.
Hi, everyone. Samuel, thank you so much for being here. It is I love, after reading a book, getting an opportunity to interrogate the author a little bit. So hopefully this will be a really, really fun hour. I want to start off by inviting Meghana to ask a question that I think kind of introduces the topic and gets us going.
Thank you, Emma. So this is like a big 5-parter question, but it kind of all is around the topic of like why you decided to write the book. So yeah, the first question in that is, what made you decide to write a book on this topic? Was there a certain part of your career that particularly prepared you to write about the war on truth? What are the main takeaways you hope audiences get from the book once it's released? And furthermore, did you have any audience in mind in particular when deciding what specific topics to write about and how you chose to present the information? So kind of about why you decided and like what your like target audience was in doing it.
Yeah, so let's try to answer a few of those. So the idea, oops, sorry, is it on me? So the idea for the book came out of conversations with friends and family after the 2016 election. There was just so much misinformation during that election cycle, which to me seemed pretty obvious. But the more I talked to people back home in Louisiana, where I grew up, the more I realized just how many people believe stuff that wasn't true. All these myths we grew up with, plus all of the new lies that were circulating around then. So I kind of became obsessed with how do we help people penetrate those barriers of belief? How do we help people see the bigger picture? How is it that these things are obvious to me, but not necessarily obvious to friends and family? And so, I think that it's a matter of, stepping further back to help people see how these beliefs are manufactured and sold like any other consumer good. So I feel like the approach was part media literacy, because we consume so much media, but few people are actually taught the differences between the mediums, and part psychology, and a lot about understanding power structures and who tends to benefit by a lot of the misinformation and lies that are out there, whether it's a profit incentive or just political power. And so I mentioned my degrees are in mass communication. I went to the Manship School of Mass Communication at LSU. where I studied advertising with a minor in psychology, and then I got a master's in media management. So in a way, the book is kind of a return to these disciplines. I did work at Lucasfilm for quite a while in product development, and then left several years ago to focus on writing and my own creative projects. And so the book kind of came out of that. I think as a writer, you have a message you want to get out, or you have something you want to say, and so it's a matter of finding the right medium to deliver the message. And so this lent itself to a book or a workshop or something along those lines. Although many ideas in the book, I also am, working on a pilot and screenplay that tackles a lot of the kind of same thing. So a lot of the ideas kind of feed into each other. As for the specific audience for the book, that's something we thought of a lot of. We talked a lot about once the publisher was on board, because it, as you guys read, you probably thought that, it seems one-sided. There are a lot of examples from one side of the aisle, but that's just reality. So do we come up with examples that are not equivalents just to make it look balanced? And I really struggled with that because the examples just aren't the same. And I think a lot of that is because of the history of propaganda and the way propaganda came about and who it serves. And it serves the power structure or the corporate class or the aristocracy or the church, or and by definition, that's usually more on one side of the aisle than the other. And so it became less about, any presenting it for any specific ideology as much as this is the truth, this is reality, and explaining how and why things occur. And so I tried to take as much of the political bend out of it as I could without, totally disregarding it. But it does come into play. It's just that it comes into play usually as a component of corporate power or the side or whatever. But and then as for the topics, like I said, I basically as many examples as possible I wanted to squeeze in. I was squeezing in examples up until like we went to print. Because anytime I find the truth behind something that we think is one way and it's not, it's something else, like I wanted that in there because I want the book to be kind of this comprehensive debunking guide, especially when it comes to corporate and political myths. And so I kind of steered clear from conspiracy theories and those things, but for the most part, yeah, if there was an example of a misinformation or disinformation campaign that's top of mind or that we're familiar with, I wanted to include it. And so the few that got cut from the book made it into the audiobook, thankfully. So yeah, hopefully that answers most of those questions.
Yeah, that was a really fantastic answer. It's interesting, like thinking about the audience of the book and like who the book is geared towards. And I love the idea of like trying to take the politics out of it, but you can't really because it's politics is personal. Like it's how we wake up in the morning. It's everywhere. I'm going to turn it over to Lexi to ask a question that I think really connects to how you were saying, even up to the end, even up to publishing, you were finding more examples of mistruth to talk about. So I'll give it over to Lexi.
Thank you, Emma. So mine goes with what Emma was just saying. But in the first chapter of How to Win the War on Truth, you discussed 5 key steps to create successful propaganda. In this day and age, do you think that propaganda can be avoided anymore, given the mass media consumption and whatnot throughout the US? And if so, what are the steps that we can take to identify propaganda and go ahead to educate others about its various existence and forms?
Yeah, I think it's definitely a lot tougher when there aren't as many gatekeepers as there used to be. With traditional media before the internet, there weren't that many gatekeepers, and so they were able to just ignore this heavily partisan ideological machine of misinformation. And as the media has changed and evolved and the internet's been introduced, it's kind of democratized the sharing of information. But as we've learned the last few years, it's democratized the sharing of misinformation as well. And so I think we have a propaganda problem as long as someone is going to benefit by selling the propaganda. And we will continue to deal with its influence until the disseminators are held accountable. I think the Alex Jones example is a really good one. He's finally being held accountable for all the lies and misinformation he's been spewing for years that are nonsense and that he knows, but he uses it for advertising dollars and to sell snake oil. And so I think that's a great example of just how fed up juries and the people are with this type of misinformation. And outlets like that, like a lot of the talk radio, they speak this hate into existence. And so I think we have to continue to hold them accountable. And a great example is what happened to Paul Pelosi just a few weeks ago. This guy didn't just wake up one day and thought, oh, I'm going to hate this guy today. Like, no, he's been fed a fountain of lies and fear mongering and demagoguery. He didn't just hatch that randomly, or stuff led to that. So his diet, hate speech, the demonization, his actions probably seemed like a reasonable next step. If you're being indoctrinated with that type of hate, then what are you supposed to do with it? You don't keep hate bottled up, or anger, or any of those negative emotions. You act on it. And so that's what happens. We're seeing it probably, it's the verdict's still out with the gay nightclub shooting. I don't know, I'm not that familiar with Colorado politics, but from what I'm seeing in the media, it sounds like, it's a very Christian conservative area with a lot of, anti-LGBT sentiment. And so if that's what you're, experiencing day in and day out, then what else do you do with that? If the message is treat these people like an other and not as one of us, then it's almost the natural next step. As for educating people on how to recognize propaganda, I hope I've laid out a good blueprint in the book. Like I said, I think it's equal parts crash course in media literacy, part psychology lesson, and part understanding the forces of power who benefit from us believing all the misinformation. So taken all together, I think these help us hone critical thinking skills so that we can better evaluate media messages and identify the ones that are complete BS.
Yeah, identifying the BS is difficult. I also this guide is like, you're an American, we're Americans, it's geared toward Americans. It would be really interesting to write a how to win the war on truth in like a more global setting. I'm currently living in Kazakhstan, and there was just a presidential election. And the news circulating that, it's interesting the ways that the pattern is similar and very different from like what we experience in America. I'm going to ask a question now, because in your last answer, you mentioned fear mongering, and something that I'm really interested in when we talk about truth is the role that emotions play, because the fear is real. Like the fear is a true experience that someone is having, even if the facts or experiences leading to that truth are not true.
Right.
Do you agree with that statement? And how would you go about kind of bringing that person closer to a worldview that is true without, while still appreciating that their emotion is a valid one? maybe.
Yeah, I mean, it's the emotional attachment that's usually the problem, right? It's the emotional attachment to all these beliefs that keep us from seeing the truth or acknowledging reality. No one wants to acknowledge when we're wrong or when we've been misled. So we cling to the beliefs that make us feel secure, that make us feel that we know what we're talking about. We don't want to have to reevaluate the world. The law of inertia just kind of keeps us from questioning things and assume that we already know whatever. And that's why emotional intelligence to me is so important. Understanding our unconscious biases and motivations and becoming more emotionally aware so that we realize when we're being manipulated emotionally. And unless, you've like gone to therapy or have gone to therapy or in the arts, the emotions often kind of go unrecognized. It's not something we're kind of used to identifying and talking about, but it's like at the root of psychology and behavioral economics. And so it's important to develop an emotional intelligence. It's been said that emotional intelligence is more important than an IQ, with like life success. And it could definitely be important to temper out of control hate, anger, fear, all of these things. Acknowledging when we're feeling these negative emotions, labeling them in the moment, instead of just letting them rule us. I mean, because we are all ruled by our emotions. And so once we start to understand what emotion is what and what's triggering it and how we're responding, that can definitely help tame them. Because otherwise, the emotions, when they're highly aroused, they just turn off critical thinking. Our fight or flight response kicks in, and we can easily be manipulated. That's how Hitler manipulated people. That's how hate crimes happen. That's, it's the negative emotions getting riled up. And so, when politicians or media outlets try to push those buttons to make us fearful or angry at some disadvantaged group, we should try to be aware of this. If we have negative feelings towards someone or some disadvantaged group who we don't know personally, and can't even explain why we have those negative feelings, like Nancy Pelosi or Hillary Clinton, or some of these other people that always seem to be the butt of a lot of hate mongering and demagoguery, then we should question why we have those feelings. Like, we don't know the person and we can't explain, oh, like she's just crooked. Oh, I just don't trust her. Yeah, but why? What did that come from? So, if we can't identify a legitimate reason, then those feelings have probably been manufactured. We've probably been manipulated by smears and fear mongering for years. So why would the media outlets do that? Manipulate us into disliking people for power, for political power, corporate power. You see this a lot in politics. If you ask people why they hate Trump, for instance, they don't hesitate to list a litany of offenses. I mean, there are, shelves and shelves of books at this point written about all his misdeeds. But let's say if people hate Obama and you ask them for concrete reasons, they usually cannot give you a similar list. Or if they can, they're not often based on facts. It's more like, oh, he's a socialist, or like, how, in what way? What has he done that, Nixon or anybody else didn't do? And so that means it's been fabricated. It's been sold by partisan media or politicians that kind of have to get you to hate someone else because they don't really stand for anything themselves. And that's one of the, the main things to notice when you see negative campaign ads, fear mongering and the demagoguery. That person running those probably don't have a lot of policy solutions if their way to victory is relying on you to hate the opponent. And that was something like the Nixon White House pioneered. They called it positive polarization. As long as I can get you to hate the other guy, it'll be a positive for me because I'll get more votes. And so, hopefully that answers the question.
And then that's such a problem because the people that are in power are the ones that don't have any policy solutions, right? They win, they get there, but then like
they do nothing.
What comes next?
Yeah. Well, and inflation, all the talk about inflation leading up to the midterms is a great example. none of the people demonizing Biden because of inflation and all these other things ever presented solutions. Like tax cuts for corporations do not stop inflation. And so, yeah, so, but, you know, if you're aroused, if you're like, damn right, I hate inflation, I'm so tired, my money doesn't go any further, you know, put somebody else in there. And instead of stopping to think, okay, but what are you doing about it? Like, what is your solution to inflation, you know? And there aren't that many people proposing solutions, you know, how about ending price gouging, you know, putting a tax on huge profits. You know, there's so much they could do regulation wise to curb corporate greed. And corporate greed is really what inflation boils down to. Like inflation's at a 40-year high, but corporate profits are at an 80-year high, something like that. And it's not just in the US, it's the globe. And so it's kind of just ludicrous when you hear these politicians blaming inflation on like a meager stimulus check from 2 years ago, as if that's how somehow responsible for inflation in the UK, which is higher than ours. And so, you know, like when poor people have money, that's not causing inflation. It's, you know, price markups that used to be 20% in 1980 are now like 60% today. So, you know, the price markup is 3 times what it used to be. That tells you where all the money's going.
Yeah, tells you where all the money is going, and at least for me, like makes me feel very stuck, like in the sense that like the people in power are not presenting solutions. Like where are the solutions? You know, where do we go from here?
Right. And there aren't that many people that campaign on solutions. And I think that's one reason when they ran, Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren were so popular, because everything out of their mouths are solutions. This is the problem, the solution, you know. And if they're demonizing anybody, it's not to score political points. It's because they're blaming the people at fault for whatever. And they're trying to hold them accountable. But they're not relying on that. They're relying on the solution. You know, how do you fix college debt? You know, make college free. How do you fix this problem? And so, yeah, I feel like that's why so many people responded to them. Unlike, you know, Trump, who wasn't running on any solutions. He was just running on fear and hate and, you know, fear of immigrants, demonizing the opponent, you know, punishing the other guy, you know, and everything was punching down, not punching up. So
yeah. Something very connected to emotion is the idea of cognitive dissidence. So I'm going to hand it over to Meghana to ask a question.
Hey, yeah, thank you. So yeah, this definitely goes off of what we were talking about. So in your book, you talk about a lot about the role cognitive dissonance plays in our inability to sometimes digest uncomfortable truths. Because this is something we do subconsciously, is there any way we can be more aware of when we do this and how to push back against the tendency to fall into it? Going off of that, like why are psychological concepts such as this one essential in our understanding of winning the war on truth?
Yeah, so cognitive dissonance, for those that aren't familiar with the term, is that uncomfortable sensation that we get when the world clashes, when the reality clashes with how we think the world works. And we choose to remain willfully blind as opposed to accepting the truth that, you know, cigarettes cause cancer, or the earth is warming, or January 6th was an insurrection. Like, so when we're confronted with these things that challenge our belief, you know, it's we kick in, the self-preservation kicks in. And, you know, there's a great book called Willful Blindness by Margaret Heffernan that I think is just a wonderful book that goes into detail about basically this cognitive dissonance, what makes people willfully blind. And, you know, and she defines it as, you know, ignoring new information and denying truths that are too uncomfortable to confront. And like admitting we're wrong, recognizing when we make mistakes, you know, it's a defense mechanism. And, you know, she argues that what makes someone willing to see the truth is not intelligence or brains, it is courage, you know, courage to face the truth, whatever that may be, the courage to accept reality. But to do that requires feeling very insecure. If you have a very comfortable view of how the world works, whether, it's your view comes from church or your political party or whatever it is. And unless that belief is seriously shattered, you're just going to reject information that would conflict that. And it's an act of self-preservation. Our brains are kind of desperate to tell us, oh, everything's okay. I don't have to worry about that. I don't have to deal with global warming. Oh, it's a fraud, or it's whatever. Just go about your daily lives, nothing to see here. So we're just prone to inertia unless pushed by extraordinary circumstances. As there's a saying, delusion comforts when truth hurts. And that's super true, which is why whistleblowers are often ignored over and over and over again until something happens that you can't deny. And, we see it at the highest level of office. Like George W. Bush was warned about, the 9/11 like 8 times that year. And the CIA kept making the brief headlines more alarming, like to get his attention. And he still just blew it off because, again, he couldn't accept that something like this could actually happen until it happened. And then everybody's like, how did we not see this happening? How did nobody stop this? And it's like, yeah, well, everybody in power ignored every warning that people sent. So the more comfortable we are in our lives and the less adversity we face, the more we're prone to just assume horrible things aren't happening to other people. Again, until we are forced to confront that. That's kind of what creates privilege, is when we haven't suffered any of these things firsthand. And when people tell us about sexism or racism, if we haven't observed it, then, oh, it must not exist. So it's easy to dismiss until something like everyone being stuck at home watching George Floyd's death on TV, finally wakes people up. You kind of have to be slapped in the face with stuff. So cognitive dissonance is a huge study of in psychology, and anything on the subject is well worth reading.
Yeah, the part about privilege in the book, privilege in general is such a tricky concept, and like makes you think about yourself more clearly and the world more clearly. It's interesting because I think in my mind, when I think about with Trump, like people who are spreading, maybe not spreading fake news, but consuming fake news are from populations of America that maybe are not as privileged economically, like that live in the Rust Belt and, don't have factory jobs anymore. So the intersection between privilege and being able to understand how truth works is fascinating to me. And I'm going to hand it over to Gianna to ask a follow-up question to that. But before, audience members, please don't forget to put any questions you have in the chat box for our Q&A.
Yes, thank you. In How to Win the War on Truth, you introduced the notion of cognitive dissonance and explain that ignorance is a privilege and those who have not experienced the truth or oppression would rather deny it, which can also be known as willful blindness, as you mentioned before. In addition, you make a claim that educated and powerful individuals are equally susceptible to the sense of privilege. So given the fact that the hard truths in life are easier to ignore if you are in a position of privilege, and it is not necessarily something someone can learn through traditional education, how can people in society learn to truly recognize the truth in order to become a better community overall?
Yeah, I guess I kind of feel like we talked about some of that in the last question a little, but one thing I'll mention is that I think it kind of goes into like the us and them, us versus them. Like particularly I'm thinking of like immigrants, like the people that are the most anti-immigrant, or the people who have little access or have never met an immigrant. Just like in Nazi Germany, the people that were the most anti-Semitic had never even met a Jew. Like it was such a fraction of the population in Germany was Jewish at the time. And they all lived in the cities. And so all the anti-Semites for the most part were in the country. And so it's so easy to buy into these myths or this misinformation if we don't have that firsthand experience. you know, just like the privilege of, you know, if we're a white person, then we are often privileged to not recognize the struggles that Black people have to go through, or if we're male, we don't recognize the struggles that females have to go through. And so identifying with people who are not like ourselves is key, you know, practicing empathy, understanding other people's point of view, and putting yourselves in that. Like one thing I don't talk a lot about it in the book, but you know, when you have this, you know, these powerful men who are sexual predators, when the women finally speak out, and people act like, oh, you know, she's just trying to get what money, like who does that? Like whoever in history, like historically does that? Like, you know, no one hardly makes up those types of stories, because when they do, they're persecuted, you know, they suffer, they're shamed, they're ostracized, it's like this, the whistleblower, you know, people don't want to accept that their beloved comedian or their favorite actor or whoever has been treating people this way. Because if they admit it, then what does that say about them? That they can be wrong, that they can, that maybe they don't have a good judge of character after all, or whatever it is. And so, you know, I feel like empathy is always key to understanding other people in their positions, and trying to identify with people who are not like us. And stories and movies and do a really great job of that. And, you know, that's one of the best things. Books, reading, you know, supposedly people that read have more empathy than those who don't. And I think they think it's because you're constantly seeing other people's points of view. You're putting yourself in someone else's shoes. You're not identifying with their skin tone or their gender. You're identifying with their struggle or their story. And so, you know, that's why storytelling is so important. And representation in storytelling is important.
Yeah, storytelling, education, critical thinking. I've been trained in like progressive education for children, but the idea of windows and mirrors, if you're familiar with that, like we need it's a way to talk about like representation of different people in the books that we read, but you need mirrors that allow you to see yourself reflected back to you. And you also need windows that allow you to see into other people's worlds. And so like the books that we have in our classrooms should be a combination of both windows and mirrors. I've found that like a really helpful and succinct way to think about that.
I like that analogy. I haven't heard that before, but that's a great, yeah, that's a great analogy.
I'm going to ask Natalie to give us a question that talks a little bit about some history, which I know we both love.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Emma. Yeah, so I'm wondering, in the conclusion to your book, you quote historian Timothy Snyder, who writes, "Post-truth is pre-fascism. To abandon facts is to abandon freedom." So on that note, Jason Stanley writes in his preface to the book How Fascism Works, that fascism is not a new threat, but rather a permanent temptation. The US has captured the attention of the world, not because of its fascist history, but because of the heroism its residents have exhibited in internal fights against it. And so I was wondering to what extent you would agree with that formulation.
Yeah, I think, yeah, the part, US has captured the attention of the world, not because of fascist history, but because of the heroism of its residents. I think that is definitely the story we highlight, which is also part of the problem, because we don't like to consider or remember when we're the antagonists, only when we're the protagonists. And so, you know, there's this great quote, I don't remember who said it, but it's something like, Americans can always be counted on to do the right thing, but only after they've exhausted every other option. And so there's a lot of truth to that. You know, I think we see this with civil rights and racism. I mean, you know, we fought a war to free Black people from slavery, but it took 100 more years before we codified their rights into law. And, you know, it's easy to say, oh, the Civil War was won and then that's it. But like, no, the backlash to the Civil War lasted 100 years. And I mean, we're still living through it to a degree today. And, you know, as much as we would like to be willfully blind about our past, you know, Hitler and the Nazi regime based many of its laws on the Jim Crow laws of the Deep South. Nazi stormtroopers were inspired by the KKK. You know, the KKK was thought to be the first real fascists. You know, we're just really good at ignoring the blemishes of our past and focusing on the positive. And that's, you know, I feel like part of the problem we struggle with in this country. Whereas Germany does not have this problem. Germany faces their past in school, and they learn from it, and they recognize it, and they respect it. And I feel like a lot of times we just try to hide it because it makes us feel uncomfortable, and we don't like to feel uncomfortable. So the willful blindness kicks in. And, you know, we would have to admit we're wrong, like the South losing the Civil War. And so, you know, the South, you know, had to kind of respin that it wasn't about slavery, it was about states' rights, because then they could make themselves look like the heroes or the victims. But that was an afterthought. You know, that language came way after the Civil War. And so, you know, so much goes back to self-preservation and not wanting to acknowledge our blunders and our mistakes of the past. And so because of that, we still fight about, you know, Black Lives Matter and critical race theory and all these things that are not issues that even should be debated. They're just reality. But we want to hide that reality. And so, yeah, you know, I think we need to learn more from just the positive, but we need to learn from our mistakes. And it's just a shame we keep trying to bury that. And so, but again, self-preservation, privilege, willful blindness, you know, they never go away.
So much of our relationship to truth and untruth in the present is based on our relationship to our past. And we've spent a lot of this discussion talking about the past. I want to talk a little bit about the future and kind of what we can do to be more prepared to share knowledge. Obviously, your book does a fantastic job of that. It's a blueprint, right, for how to win the war on truth. And Lexi has a question to ask a little bit more about your background and kind of the skills that you have to write such a book.
Okay, thank you, Emma. So I know that it can be hard to inform large groups of people of news or information, regardless of whether or not that information is good or bad. And that being said, how has your work as a journalist influenced the way that you communicate truths to the general public?
Yeah, so I'm trying to think. I guess I kept, for the longest time, I would just try to educate with facts and data. And that just wasn't working. And it drives me crazy when you know something is true or you know a falsehood's a falsehood, but someone believes it. And so how do you know, help them see that? And that was, you know, the challenge with the book and the inspiration was how far back do we have to step? And because, you know, facts arguing faith doesn't work. If you have faith in a belief, then facts just bounce off of it. And so, you know, there was a really good analogy. I don't remember, I'm going to screw the names up, so I won't even try. But there was like a German scientist who studied like how an animal's entire world is their immediate environment. So like if a mouse is running through the grass, like the world to him is that field of grass. Like that's all he knows about the world. And, you know, if a fish is in the ocean, his entire world is just water. He didn't know about anything else. And so, you know, he pioneered this concept. And again, the names are German. And so I just screw them up. Sorry. I don't know how to keep that from beeping. And so the trick is, right, how do you help people see the rest of the world? Not just their environment and their echo chambers and, you know, their very small bubble that's insulated with their own beliefs, but to see other people and how the world works. And so, you know, that was kind of one of the challenges, the goals with the book. And to me, that is, you know, media literacy, understanding the different types of propaganda. I guess we didn't talk too much about this, but you know, media consumption, we consume so much media, but we can't always tell the difference when we consume a message. And it doesn't equate to media literacy. So, it's important that we learn to distinguish journalism from public relations, from publicity, from advertising, from branding. Only journalism and storytelling usually is concerned with getting to the truth. The others are just trying to obscure it. They're trying to sell us something. And so the aim of the book is to help people look at these forms of mass communication with a wider lens. So, we think of marketing as promoting a new movie, or advertising as promoting a Black Friday sale or something. But it's also responsible for getting us to take a coffee break or celebrate Valentine's Day or believe incorrectly that Iraq had weapons of mass destruction. These were ideas or products that didn't exist until successful marketing campaigns came along. Or branding, we think of branding as like Wheaties being the breakfast of champions. But it's, Samuel Adams calling a Boston riot that killed 5 people a massacre because he wanted to stir up anti-British sentiment. It's politicians labeling themselves tough on crime or law and order, labels they never live up to. It's just coded language. And so, teaching people to recognize these things for what they are. If a politician runs on tough on crime or law and order, what does that mean? Like, what are your policies? What do you want to do? Lock up more people of color? Because that's usually what that means. That's what the coded language is. And so, when we see that, we should identify, no, that's branding. You're just trying to brand your opponent as being soft on crime, or you're dog whistling that you want to get more minorities off the streets. And so, recognizing these things for what they are is part of the lesson. And, the first part of the book, I hope, deals with that. And then, psychological awareness, making ourselves aware of our emotions when they're invoked, when they're riled up, when they're exploited, and then understanding, the power structure in a way to explain things we may not quite understand. Always understanding. And I feel like all of history is a struggle between 2 forces, someone trying to either change the world for the better, improve conditions, some type of public service, equal rights, marriage equality, allowing Blacks to sit at the same, or Black people to sit at the same lunch counter as white people, like these positive changes in society. And then the other force is resisting. It's the power structure. It's someone who's going to lose power if these things happen. If Black people have the right to vote, who loses power? The white majority. If women have the right to vote, who loses power? The male majority. If gay people have the right to something, who loses power? Perceived straight people. And so instead of looking at issues as, political or this side or that side, it should always be like, who is the positive force for change and who is trying to resist that change because their power is threatened. And I feel like that's, such a foundation of understanding myths and BS and misinformation, is questioning who benefits by us believing things. And that's why the propaganda often comes from those resisting change. Because how do you fight equal rights? How do you fight equality? How do you fight saving the planet? How do you fight universal health care? You can't, because those are just the right thing to do. So you have to manufacture a debate where there is no debate, or you have to demonize the messenger, or you have to turn to negative tactics. And so, which is where the emotions come in, which is where, they're all just so interrelated. So I hope that answered that question. I feel like I just kind of got off it.
No, that was great. It stimulated. Before we officially move on to the Q&A, I'm going to start the Q&A by asking my own question. But audience members, please put your questions in the question box. You talked about initially in your journey as a journalist wanting to argue only with facts. Something that I find really interesting is the fact that How to Win the War on Truth is an illustrated guide rather than just a book with text. Why? And to me, I mean, this is a fake delineation, but like pictures are not based in fact, like they're, maybe emotional or funny. So why an illustrated guide?
Yeah, I get asked that question a lot. And I think I kind of always imagined it illustrated. I don't know if you guys have ever come across a book called Economics with an X on the end, by Michael Goodwin. It's like Abrams Comic Arts, but it's similar to my book. It was the inspiration for the format. So it's like the world history of economics in like a comic form. And the illustrations are just, they're fun and they're humorous. And what would otherwise be this really dry topic is made incredibly charming and fun. And I just loved that book when I discovered it. And so as I began thinking of how to turn this into a book, I thought, it could go in two directions. It could be fully illustrated like that, or it could be more of spot illustrations here and there for like charts and data and tables, like a Randall Munroe book or something. But either way, I knew the illustrations would be important, mostly because of that 4-quadrant learning tool. Like I felt like that was an important concept that I wanted to have in the book, and because of that, that meant there needed to be a graphic element with and with charts and tables and graphs. I feel like they illustrate the points a lot more when you see the curves and the lines. And so it could go in one of two ways. And so in the book proposal, I actually, left it open depending on what the publisher wanted. And I think the publisher and my agent and everyone was pretty much in agreement that they thought the, fully illustrated was the way to go, because it could break down these otherwise academic concepts, complex concepts, into a very accessible way, to the widest possible audience. And I agreed. And I also thought that the illustrations could provide a healthy dose of whimsy and humor, which I really wanted, because my natural voice is just kind of ironic and sarcastic. And so I hope that comes through in a lot of the art. So jokes that necessarily couldn't be made within the text, I felt like their commentary or political op-ed type nods could go into the art. And I think the artist Alan Wincup, who's out of Canada, did a great job, and super fast. Yeah, there was a lot of illustrations in that book.
Yeah, the jokes definitely do come through. And if anyone has not, I feel very lucky that we got kind of a preview of the book, and I would highly recommend it to all of our audience members. I think it's time to turn it over to the Q&A to let those audience members ask some questions. So Lexi, if you want to get us started on that front.
Okay, yes, thank you. Okay, so the first one I'm going to begin with is, what specific tools do you think should be used in education to help students develop critical thinking and more of an open mind?
Again, I think psychology, emotional intelligence, I think those are crucial for not just for this, but just for personal development. As you get older, encountering people with very different personalities, with baggage, with people that haven't gotten their own stuff straight, that often takes years to sort out. I just feel like psychology in general is just leads to such a healthier frame of mind, such healthier habits, awareness and understanding of your past and what made you who you are and what you're sensitive to and what you respond to. I think just goes a long way in generating empathy for other people, recognizing adversity and suffering. And so, that striking down the privilege. So often when people do go to therapy, they start with, oh, I had a wonderful childhood, or I had whatever, and it's like, no, like that's nobody had perfect anything. Like, anytime if you create a story or you're writing, like your character never has, the childhood we all think we had. There's still moments that define us, and there are still messages that shame us, or there's and so just understanding these things and putting them in context, I think goes a long way. And then actually one of the biggest recommendations I have that's totally not in the book, I took all of this out, is understanding, I think, storytelling, the arts and storytelling. I don't think I can stress enough how understanding the basics of story allows you to interpret real world events in such a clearer way. When you have to construct a character and when you have to identify where the antagonism is, what is the protagonist wanting? What is their goal? How do they need to change in a positive way? How are they trying to change the world around them? And then conceiving the antagonist, who is standing in their way? What does the antagonist want? It just makes it very easy to see, whether it's Norma Ray fighting for a union, or it's, Moses or Gandhi or Martin Luther King, like who is the protagonist and who is the antagonist? Who is standing in their way? If Lincoln freed the slaves, who loses power? Who's the antagonist? The slave system, the plantation system, free labor. And so understanding, the rules of storytelling and the dynamics of, antagonism, I feel like go a long way. Robert McKee, a lot of the great screenwriters, I feel like they deal with a lot of the same, they deal with those dynamics. I feel like that's how I've learned a lot of it. And it just makes it so much easier to interpret the BS, especially, if you've ever tried writing it, like, what's BS and what's a real motivation and what's BS. So yeah, I would say, arts and story are great for society in ways that we wouldn't otherwise think.
Thank you. And also kind of to follow up the maybe social dynamics of what you were talking about. Another question we had was, what do you think about cancel culture? Do you think that we should simply silence people who spread fake news, or is it more complicated than that?
Yeah, I think it's complicated in that I think of cancel culture as sort of like what politically correct, the label politically correct was in the 90s. And so, you may have heard PC. I remember reading in a magazine when I was like y'all's age. And it said, "Are you PC?" And I was like, "What does that mean?" And I was like, "Okay, politically correct." I was like, "What does that mean?" Like, and I still never quite got it, but now I get it. So what politically correct was, as on college campuses, as gay and lesbian organizations were being formed, as feminist teachers were getting tenure, as using the N-word and racism was being frowned on. These changes are positive changes towards equality and towards a better world. So again, how do you fight that? If you don't want women, faculty members, if you don't want your racism to be curbed, if you don't want these things, then you have to find a way to demonize all that. And so politically correct became this label, like we're being silenced. We have to be PC. We have to be politically correct, which was really just a deflection of, to fight all of these things. And so I see cancel culture as sort of like that in a way, like people that, there's a legitimate cancel culture problem if someone makes a mistake on social media and then they're fired or something. Like, that's a bit extreme. Like, people need to be able to make mistakes and learn by them and apologize and correct the behavior and move on. You can't have something dug up from 10 years ago that you said on Facebook, and then all of a sudden now, like, you lose all your income. What are you supposed to do? Like, that's bad cancel culture taken to, an extreme. That's a knee-jerk reaction. But the way one political party uses the term, they're not talking about that. They're talking about them being corrected, or them being held accountable for their racism, or them being held responsible for the hate speech they're spewing. And so, like, when, what was the Dr. Seuss stuff, and like the political party was complaining about, oh, cancel culture, Dr. Seuss has been canceled. Like, what are you talking about? It was his estate that decided, these are kind of questionable. Like, we don't want to be these people. We're not going to publish these books anymore. It doesn't mean you can't find the books. Hell, they've been published for like 50, 60 years. It's them, having a realization that the times have changed and we would like to change with the times instead of be fossils. And this party just using that as, as another demonizing talking point. Like, oh, look what the other side wants to do. They want to cancel your childhood and again, that's not a policy. Like, what's their policy? Is their policy to promote more racist publishing? Like, what is it that they want? And they don't have a policy. All they want to do is feed on that perception that someone is being told, you know, had their freedom of speech taken away. So I think we need to, whenever someone uses the term cancel culture, then we need to like, you know, antenna should go off, like, you know, what are they talking about? You know, are they just using this as an excuse for inappropriate behavior? But the actual canceling of someone, you know, I mean, it's such a case-by-case basis. I think it depends on the severity, it depends on who they offended, if the person even had a problem with it. Yeah, that's such a case-by-case. Anyway, it's a complicated, complex conversation. And so I didn't put much of cancel culture in the book because of that. Like, I feel like it's one of those things that it means different things to different people, and I just don't have the space. So.
Well, thank you so much. I cannot believe that this hour is now over, but I want to thank you again for coming and speaking with us, and for all of the viewers for tuning in and asking questions. And before we wrap up, I wanted to make an announcement that our next program, the last, unfortunately, in the series, is Wednesday, December 21st at 4 p.m. and it will feature a roundtable discussion with the members of the Student Council about what the series has meant to us and what it's brought in terms of a deeper insight into the concept of truth. So again, thank you everyone for coming, and thank you, Samuel, for speaking.
Awesome. Thank you for having me, and perfect timing because I'm just now losing daylight.
Bye.
So awesome. Bye.